The porch boards creaked under the weight of memory as Caleb Harrison settled into his chair, the wood worn smooth by 3 decades of mountain wind and contemplation. At 64, his hands carried the permanent stains of a life lived close to the earth, scars running like rivers across knuckles that had known both violence and tenderness. The spring air of 1903 held the promise of new grass and old stories, and his grandson sat beside him, 19 years young, and eager for answers that only age could provide. Caleb Jr. shifted in his chair, his uniform buttons catching the late afternoon sun. In 1 week, he would board a train eastward toward conflicts the newspapers spoke of in careful language, in uncertain predictions. The boy had the Harrison jaw strong and set with determination, but his eyes held questions that couldn't wait for convenient moments. "Grandpa, they say you killed 12 men. Is it true?" The old man's gaze drifted toward the peaks that had sheltered him for so long, their granite faces unchanged by human turbulence. A smile touched his weathered features, not from pride but from the strange arithmetic of survival. 13, but only one haunts me. He reached for his pipe, the ritual of tobacco and flame, giving shape to thoughts that had waited decades for proper telling. Inside the expanded cabin, sounds of women preparing supper drifted through open windows. Grace's voice among them, still clear and strong, at 56 directing daughters and granddaughters, with the same steady certainty she had brought to everything in their shared life. "Let me tell you how I met your grandmother," Caleb said, striking the match. "Let me tell you about the day I bought 2 elk hides worth of trouble and found something I didn't know I was looking for." The smoke curled upward, and with it the years fell away. Autumn of 1873 arrived in the Colorado Rockies with the kind of cold that made a man respect his mortality. Caleb Harrison, 34 years old and 9 years removed from the last conversation he'd had with his father, guided his horses down the mountain trail with the practiced ease of someone who had made peace with solitude. 2 pack animals followed behind him, their loads of beaver pelts and elk hides representing 4 months of work in elevations where winter came early and stayed late. The aspens had turned to gold, their leaves trembling in a wind that carried warnings of snow. Pine forests stretched dark and deep on either side of the narrow trail, and somewhere in those shadows a hawk screamed its hunting cry. Caleb registered these details the way a man reads a familiar book, finding comfort in patterns that required no explanation. He stood 6 feet and 2 inches when he bothered to stand straight, but mountain life had taught him to move with a slight forward lean, shoulders broad from the constant work of survival. His face carried the geography of exposure lines etched deep around eyes that had seen more than they cared to remember. A scar ran from his left cheekbone to his collar, a souvenir from a grizzly encounter that had taught him the difference between confidence and arrogance. His Hawken rifle rested across his saddle, its presence as natural as breathing, and the hunting knife at his belt had been his father's before their final bitter parting. The trading post sat at the mountain's base like a necessary evil, a place where the wilderness met commerce, and neither side felt entirely comfortable with the arrangement. Caleb made this journey twice yearly when supplies ran too low to ignore and isolation became impractical rather than philosophical. He needed salt coffee, ammunition flour, and the kind of sugar that made winter mornings slightly less brutal. Beyond that, he wanted nothing the civilized world had to offer. Porter's trading post appeared through the trees, its weathered boards and crooked chimney somehow still standing, despite looking perpetually on the verge of collapse. 3 horses stood tied to the hitching rail, and a wagon sat in the yard behind the building, surrounded by men whose laughter carried an edge that made Caleb's shoulders tighten. Samuel Porter emerged onto the porch as Caleb approached his 50-some years, showing in the stoop of his back and the permanent squint of someone who had spent too long reading ledgers by poor light. He raised a hand in greeting, but his expression carried a warning that words wouldn't quite capture. "Harrison, been 4 months." About that, Caleb dismounted, tying his lead horse with a knot that could be released in one quick pull. Old habits from cavalry days when speed mattered more than security. "Need the usual supplies." Porter glanced toward the back of his building, then lowered his voice to something barely above a whisper. "Wade Drummond's in town. Brought cargo from a raided wagon train up north." The name settled in Caleb's gut like spoiled meat. Drummond ran one of the bandit operations that plagued the territory, too smart to get caught and too connected to hang when he was. The kind of man who understood that law was a luxury the frontier couldn't always afford, and who profited from that understanding in ways that turned Caleb's stomach. "Not my concern." Caleb said the words, but something in him already knew they were a lie. "He's got a woman chained out back, selling her like livestock. Still not my concern." But even as Caleb said it, his feet carried him around the side of the building, drawn by something he couldn't name and wouldn't admit if he could. Later, he would wonder if it was God or simple human decency that moved him. At the time, it felt like neither. It felt like inevitability. The freight yard spread out behind Porter's building, a space where commerce happened in its ugliest forms. 8 men stood in a loose circle around a wagon, their attention focused on something Caleb couldn't yet see. Their clothes marked them as drifters and trappers, men who lived in the spaces between law and lawlessness, beholden to neither and trusted by none. Wade Drummond stood at the center of their attention, a man of 40 whose face showed the particular hardness that came from making cruelty profitable. He wore a coat too fine for the surrounding stolen goods worn like a uniform, and his smile held the kind of confidence that came from knowing he was the most dangerous person in any room he entered. "Gentlemen, let's be realistic about value here," Drummond was saying, his voice carrying the practiced rhythm of a man who had given this speech before. "This merchandise came from a Catholic missionary wagon. That means she's educated, can read, write, cook, clean. She's worth more than most of the stock you will find in these parts." Caleb pushed through the circle of men, and his heart stopped. She knelt beside the wagon wheel, chained by her ankles to the heavy wood. Her black habit hung in tatters, barely covering a body that had clearly endured weeks of abuse. Dirt and bruises marked her face, and her dark hair fell in tangled masses around shoulders, drawn tight with tension. But her eyes held something the men around her had missed. They weren't broken. They were calculating. Her hands, bound together at the wrists, clutched a rosary with a grip that spoke of faith or desperation, or the thin space where those two things met. She didn't look at the men directly, keeping her gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance, a survival strategy Caleb recognized from his own experiences with capture during the war. $10 or equivalent trade," Drummond announced, gesturing at her like she was a particularly fine horse. "I'm being generous, gentlemen. She can earn her keep twice over if you know how to manage property properly." The woman flinched at the word property, a tiny movement most of the men missed. Caleb didn't miss it. He saw the way her fingers tightened on the rosary beads, the slight tremor in her shoulders, that she fought to control the careful breathing of someone trying to stay invisible in a crowd that saw her all too clearly. "She trouble?" one of the trappers asked, spitting tobacco juice onto the ground near her feet. "What woman isn't?" Drummond laughed and the men joined him. "But she learned to keep quiet after the first week. Haven't heard a peep out of her in days." Caleb's hand moved to his rifle before his mind caught up with his instincts. Every part of his rational thinking said to walk away. He had spent 9 years avoiding exactly this kind of involvement. He had left Missouri in his father's church precisely because he was tired of trying to save people who didn't want saving, tired of moral crusades that cost more than they were worth. But something about the way she held that rosary, the way she maintained dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away, made walking away impossible. He stepped forward. The crowd parted slightly, recognizing the kind of man who moved with violence, always close to the surface. Caleb kept his face neutral, his voice level, giving nothing away. "I'll trade 2 prime elk hides and a winter bearskin." Drummond's smile widened, showing teeth that had seen better days. "Well, now, didn't take Harrison for the marrying type. Or are you the keeping type?" "Didn't ask what you took me for." The woman's eyes flicked to Caleb for the first time, a quick assessment that revealed intelligence working behind the exhaustion. She was trying to determine if this was rescue or merely a transfer to different ownership. Caleb understood the question, even if she didn't voice it. Drummond walked a slow circle around Caleb, making a show of consideration. "Those are quality hides, I'll grant you. But what makes you think I'm in a trading mood rather than a selling mood? Because you've been standing here for 20 minutes and nobody's pulled out cash money." Caleb's voice stayed flat, stating facts without heat. "Trade goods spend just as well, and we both know it." The bandit leader stopped circling, his expression shifting from amusement to calculation. He studied Caleb the way a man studies a poker opponent, looking for tells and finding none. "Throw in that Hawken rifle, and we have a deal. The hides and the bearskin, that's the offer. The rifle's worth 3 times what she is. Then take the hides or find another buyer." The standoff lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but it felt longer. The other men had gone quiet, sensing something shifting in the dynamic. Drummond finally shrugged the gesture of a man who had made his profit regardless of which trade he accepted. Porter can hold the goods until I'm ready to transport. Cut her loose, boys. One of Drummond's men moved forward with a key, unlocking the chains at her ankles with rough efficiency. She swayed when the restraints fell away, her legs unsteady from hours in the same position. Caleb stepped closer, ready to catch her if she fell, but she steadied herself against the wagon, refusing to show more weakness than necessary. She's your problem now, mountain man. Drummond wiped his hands on his coat as if washing away responsibility. Don't come crying when you figure out Catholic women are more trouble than they're worth. Wasn't planning on crying. Caleb gestured toward his horses, a small movement that conveyed direction without force. The woman looked at him, then at the horses, then at the circle of men who had been contemplating her purchase moments before. She took one careful step, then another, testing her freedom against her fear. Can you ride? It was the first time he'd spoken directly to her, and she seemed surprised by the question. Her voice came out rough, damaged from disuse or screaming, or both. Yes. He untied one of his pack horses and swung up onto his own mount, waiting while she approached the spare animal with the caution of someone who had learned not to trust kindness. She pulled herself into the saddle with movements that spoke of some riding experience, though pain clearly accompanied the effort. The men watched in silence as Caleb turned both horses toward the trail leading back into the mountains. He didn't look back, didn't acknowledge Drummond's final comment about fools and their money. He simply rode, and after a moment's hesitation, she followed. The trail climbed steadily from Porter's trading post, leaving behind the sounds of rough men and rougher commerce. Caleb kept the pace slow, aware that the woman behind him was riding on will more than strength. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. The only sounds came from the horses' hooves on packed earth, the creak of leather, and the occasional call of birds in the dense forest surrounding them. She used the silence to study him. He felt her eyes on his back, on his hands, as they held the reins on the rifle that he had refused to trade despite its value. She was assessing, calculating, trying to determine what kind of danger she had exchanged for the danger she knew. Grace Marlowe, though Caleb didn't yet know her name, had spent 3 weeks learning the mathematics of survival. The missionary wagon had left St. Anne. Louis with such hope, such certainty that God's work would protect them from the realities of frontier violence. Father Benedict had led morning prayers right up until the moment a bullet ended his certainty. Sister Agnes and Sister Catherine had died trying to protect the medical supplies, believing sanctity would shield them. Grace had run. She wasn't proud of it, but she was alive because of it. And in the weeks that followed, passed from one captor to another, like currency, she had learned that silence was her best weapon. Men talked more when women didn't. They revealed their intentions, their fears, their weaknesses. She had listened, waited, and survived. This man was different. He hadn't spoken except to make his trade, hadn't touched her except to prevent her fall. His movements carried a controlled violence that spoke of military training, but he directed that potential force outward towards threats, not inward toward her. It confused her almost as much as it comforted her. They had been riding for perhaps 90 minutes when she finally broke the silence. Where are you taking me? Caleb didn't turn in his saddle, but his shoulders shifted slightly, acknowledging the question. Somewhere safer than back there. Safe for you or safe for me? Now he did look back just briefly, and she caught a glimpse of something in his eyes that might have been respect or might have been surprise. Same thing near as I can figure. Why did you buy me? The question came out harder than she intended, sharpened by weeks of humiliation. Didn't buy you. His voice stayed level, but she heard something underneath it, something like anger held in check. Paid to get you away from them. Difference matters. Does it? I'm still following you into the mountains. Still dependent on your goodwill. Still property, just with a different owner. You're free to turn that horse around anytime you want. I'll point you toward the nearest settlement. Give you enough supplies to reach it. Your choice. She studied the back of his head, looking for deception and finding only weariness. The offer sounded genuine, which made it more confusing than a lie would have been. Men didn't trade valuable goods for nothing. Men didn't offer freedom to women they had claimed. Men didn't. But even as she thought it, she realized she was thinking of the men she had known in the past weeks, not men in general. Her father had been kind. Father Benedict had been gentle. Not all men were drumming. "I'll keep following for now," she said finally. "Your choice," he repeated, and they continued upward. The mountains rose around them as they climbed granite and pine, replacing the softer landscapes below. The air grew thinner and colder, carrying scents of snow and stone. Aspen groves blazed gold against darker evergreens, and somewhere high above an eagle circled on thermal currents that Caleb read like other men read newspapers. Grace's body protested the climb. Weeks of poor food and constant stress had weakened her more than she wanted to admit. Her hands ached from gripping the reins, her legs trembled from the effort of staying mounted, and her head swam with altitude and exhaustion. But she didn't complain. Complaining had never helped. Caleb noticed her struggling around the third hour. He slowed his pace further, though they were already moving at barely more than a walk. At a small clearing where water ran clear over smooth stones, he stopped. "We'll rest here." He dismounted and moved to help her down, but she waved him off, determined to manage on her own. Her legs nearly gave out when her feet hit the ground, but she locked her knees and stayed upright through sheer stubbornness. Caleb filled his canteen from the stream and held it out to her without comment. She took it, pride warring with thirst until thirst won. The water tasted of minerals and mountain cold, and she drank deeply before returning the container. "How much further?" "Another 2 hours at this pace. Can you make it?" "I'll make it." He nodded, accepting her word without question, and she felt something shift in her chest. When was the last time someone had believed her simply because she said something was true? By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had begun its descent behind the western peaks. The valley opened before them like a secret, a hidden space where mountain walls created shelter and the stream provided everything a person might need to survive. The cabin sat small and solid against the tree-lined smoke rising from its chimney in a thin column that spoke of a fire left banked, but not dead. Grace took in the barn, the smokehouse, the careful organization of wood piles and tool storage. Everything spoke of a man who lived alone by choice but not by incompetence. This wasn't a hermit's desperate hiding place. This was a home deliberately crafted and carefully maintained. "Wait here." Caleb dismounted and approached the cabin, his hand never far from his rifle. Old habits, Grace thought. Soldier's habits. She watched as he checked the door, swept his gaze across the clearing, confirmed that nothing had been disturbed in his absence. Only when he was satisfied did he return to her. "Water's heated. There's soap and cloth inside for washing. Door doesn't lock from the outside." She stared at him, trying to understand the statement. "You're letting me wash alone. You're letting yourself wash alone. I'll see to the horses." He moved away before she could respond, leading both animals toward the barn with the same steady competence he brought to everything. Grace stood frozen for a moment, then forced her legs to carry her toward the cabin. Inside, the space was exactly what the exterior promised. One room perhaps 20 feet square with a stone fireplace taking up most of the far wall. A single cot sat in one corner, neatly made with what looked like bear fur covering rough wool blankets. A table occupied the center of the room, surrounded by two simple chairs. Shelves lined one wall, holding supplies in careful order. The rifle rack above the door was empty because Caleb had taken his weapon with him. But what drew her attention was the basin of water on the table, steam still rising from its surface, and beside it a worn but clean shirt and pair of wool pants. For the first time since the massacre, Grace felt tears threaten. Not from fear or pain, but from the simple kindness of heated water and the privacy to use it. She barred the door from the inside, not because she expected intrusion, but because the ability to control her own space felt like a luxury beyond measure. Then she stripped away the torn remnants of her habit, the garment that had once meant everything and now felt like chains of a different sort. The water was perfect. Not too hot, not too cold, just warm enough to loosen muscles that had forgotten how to relax. She scrubbed at weeks of accumulated dirt and fear, watching the water turn gray and not caring. When she was as clean as she could manage, she dried herself with the cloth he had left and considered the clothes. The shirt hung enormous on her frame, and the pants required rolling at the waist and ankles. But they were clean and whole, and when she caught sight of herself in the small mirror hanging by the door, she saw a person rather than property for the first time in weeks. When she emerged clean and dressed in borrowed clothing, Caleb was splitting wood outside the barn. His axe rose and fell with a rhythm that spoke of countless repetitions, each swing perfectly controlled. He didn't stop when she appeared, but she saw him register her presence in the slight pause between strokes. "There's stew on the fire. Help yourself." Grace found a tin bowl and ladled out thick venison stew that smelled better than anything she could remember eating. She sat at the table and forced herself to eat slowly, though her body screamed for more faster. Drummond's men had fed her enough to keep her alive, but not enough to keep her strong. This was the first real meal she'd had in weeks. Caleb entered when she was halfway through the bowl. He moved to the far side of the room, putting the table between them, and began organizing supplies with unnecessary attention to detail. She recognized the gesture for what it was. He was giving her space while staying present, available for questions, but not forcing conversation. "What's your name?" she asked finally. "Caleb Harrison." "I'm Grace Marlowe." She paused, then added, "I was Sister Grace of the Order of Mercy." "Was Bao? I don't know anymore." The honesty surprised her. "The order's gone. The mission's destroyed. I'm not sure what vows mean when there's no one left to hold them to." Caleb nodded slowly as if the theological complexity required serious consideration. "Seems like a question worth taking time to answer." "And you? Are you running from something or towards something out here?" His hands stilled on the supplies he'd been arranging. "Both? Neither? I'm just here." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got tonight." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Grace finished her stew and set the bowl aside, exhaustion finally overtaking the adrenaline that had kept her moving all day. "Where do I sleep?" Caleb gestured toward the cot. "There, warmest spot in the cabin." "And you?" "Barn's fine. I've slept in worse." "You don't have to." "I know." He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "But you need to know you're not trapped here, that you're safe to sleep without worrying about who's watching. So I'll be in the barn. Door doesn't lock from the outside, and my horse is saddled if you need to leave in the night. Your choice always." He left before she could respond, pulling the door closed behind him, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. Grace stood alone in the cabin, in the warmth, in the safety, in the terrifying freedom of choice, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that she might survive this. She lay down on the cot, wrapped in the bear fur that smelled faintly of pine and smoke, and sleep took her before she could wonder whether trusting Caleb Harrison was wisdom or simply exhaustion making decisions her rational mind would regret. The first morning arrived with the kind of light that made the mountains look painted rather than real. Grace woke slowly, confused by the absence of chains and the presence of genuine warmth. For a moment, panic flared as she remembered she was alone with a strange man in a place beyond help or law. Then memory returned more fully, and with it a cautious hope. The cabin was empty, but the fire had been tended. Fresh wood crackled in the hearth, and the kettle on its hook steamed gently. He had been inside while she slept close enough to touch, and he had chosen to feed the fire instead. The message was clear whether he intended it or not. She found him outside splitting wood with the same rhythmic precision she had observed the night before. Each swing of the axe was controlled powerful, a demonstration of strength used for construction rather than destruction. He acknowledged her approach with a slight nod, but didn't stop working. "Coffee's ready. Cups are by the fire." Grace poured herself a cup and returned outside, standing at a distance that felt safe while she watched him work. The morning air was cold enough to show her breath, and she wrapped her hands around the tin cup for warmth. "What do you expect from me?" The question made him pause mid-swing. He lowered the axe and turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Nothing you're not ready to give. Men don't do this without reason. I'm not most men." He set the axe aside and leaned against the chopping block. "You can stay until you're strong enough to decide what comes next. No obligations, no ownership." Why? The word came out sharper than she intended, carrying weeks of suspicion and survival. "Why would you help a stranger?" Caleb's smile was bitter, touching his eyes with something that looked like old pain. "Maybe I'm trying to do one decent thing before I die. Maybe I'm tired of watching good people get destroyed by bad ones. Maybe I don't need a reason beyond knowing it's right." "You sound like a preacher." "My father was a preacher. I'm just a man trying to live with his choices." He established rules, then speaking with the kind of clarity that came from having thought through every detail. She could leave anytime she wanted, and he would guide her to the nearest settlement with enough supplies to reach it safely. She could help with chores if she wished, but he expected nothing. He would sleep in the barn until she felt safe enough to allow him back in the cabin. The creek had boundaries. She bathed upstream, he stayed downstream, and neither crossed that line without warning. "And if I choose to stay," she asked, testing the boundaries of this strange freedom, "then you stay. Simple as that." The first week passed in a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. Caleb maintained his routines, checking trap lines, hunting, repairing equipment, preserving meat for the winter that was already sending scouts in the form of early snow flurries. Grace watched, rested, and slowly began to believe that his offer of safety was genuine. She noticed things: the way he said grace before meals, silent and brief but sincere; the Bible on the shelf worn from reading and marked with notes in careful handwriting; the way he avoided talking about God or faith or anything that might require him to justify his beliefs. He was a man in conversation with something larger than himself, but it was a private conversation, and he guarded it carefully. On the fourth day, she began helping without being asked. She gathered kindling, drew water, tended the fire. Small tasks that needed doing, and gave her hands something to do besides shake with remembered fear. Caleb didn't thank her or comment on her contributions. He simply adjusted his routines to accommodate her presence, leaving tasks within easy reach and accepting her help as naturally as he would accept the sunrise. On the fifth day, they had their first real conversation while working together to process an elk hide. She asked him where he had learned the skill, and he told her about his father teaching him back before they stopped speaking. The door to his past opened just a crack, and she saw pain there that matched her own. On the sixth day, she examined her rosary alone in the cabin while he worked outside. The beads felt familiar in her hands, but the prayers felt distant. She had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But her order was destroyed, her sisters dead, and the church hierarchy was 500 miles away. Did vows still bind when the structure that gave them meaning had collapsed? She prayed for guidance and received only silence. That night, she noticed herself watching Caleb with something beyond gratitude. The way he moved with quiet competence. The way he offered respect without demanding anything in return. The way he carried violence like a tool rather than an identity. It confused her, these feelings that had nothing to do with vows or salvation and everything to do with being human in the presence of another human who made her feel safe. On the seventh day, Caleb returned from checking his trap lines with darkness in his expression. He didn't speak immediately, just stood staring down the valley, his jaw tight. "Someone's been tracking through here. Boot prints, fresh horse droppings. They're not just passing through." Fear returned like an old friend, familiar and cold. "They followed us, maybe, or word spread and brought hunters." He looked at her directly. "There's always men willing to collect on human cargo. We need to be ready." He taught her to shoot his spare pistol that afternoon, a Colt revolver that felt heavy in her hands. She had told him about her vows of peace, and he had responded with words that stayed with her. Peace doesn't mean letting evil win. It means choosing when to fight and what's worth protecting. The eighth day brought the test they both knew was coming. Grace was at the creek washing clothes in the cold water while watching the tree line with the wariness that had become second nature. She didn't hear them approach until they were already there, two men emerging from the forest like wolves testing a fence. She recognized the first one immediately. Pete Garris, one of Drummond's lieutenants, a man whose face she had memorized during the weeks of captivity. His smile showed teeth filed to points, an affectation meant to intimidate, and it worked. "Well now, sister, Drummond sent us to reclaim his property." Grace backed toward the cabin, her hand finding the pistol Caleb had insisted she carry. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice stayed steady. "Leave, now!" The second man circled behind her, cutting off her retreat. Garris laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Mountain Man ain't here to protect you now, and we've got better offers than whatever he traded. Come quiet, and this goes easy." She drew the pistol, her hands shaking but her grip firm. "I said leave." They laughed louder, right up until Caleb's voice cut through the clearing like a blade. "She gave you an order." He stood 20 feet away, his Hawken rifle steady, aimed at Garris with the calm of someone who had made this kind of shot 100 times before. His face showed no anger, no fear, just the absolute certainty of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of and what he was willing to do. Garris raised his hand slowly, his smile fading. "Now, Harrison, let's be reasonable. Drummond wants her back and he's willing to pay. We can all profit here. You can leave breathing or not at all, your choice. The standoff lasted perhaps 10 seconds. The second man's hand twitched toward his gun, and Caleb's rifle shifted a fraction of an inch in his direction. That tiny movement, perfectly controlled, communicated more than words could. This was a man who would shoot, who could shoot, and who wouldn't lose sleep over the necessity. Garrus read it correctly. This ain't over, Harrison, word's spreading. Drummond's offering double to whoever brings her in. Every bounty hunter and drifter between here and Denver's going to be looking for easy money. Then they'll find what you found. Now get moving. The two men backed away slowly, their eyes never leaving Caleb's rifle. When they reached the tree line, Garrus turned and shouted one last warning. You're protecting her now, but winter's coming. You can't watch her every second. Someone's going to collect, and when they do, Drummond's going to make you watch. Then they were gone, swallowed by the force that had birthed them. Caleb lowered his rifle and turned to Grace. She stood with the pistol, still raised her hands steady, now her face showing the kind of determination that came from choosing to fight rather than having fighting chosen for her. They'll come back, he said quietly. I know. With more men. And when winter locks us in, they'll wait until we're weak and desperate. I know, she repeated, then added, I should leave. I'm putting you in danger. You leave when you choose to, not when they force you. His voice carried absolute conviction. We'll prepare for winter and for siege. If they come, we'll be ready. Grace looked at the mountains surrounding them, beautiful and isolating in equal measure. She looked at Caleb, this strange man who had traded valuable goods for nothing but the chance to do right by someone who needed it. She thought about running again, about always running, about dying slowly from the exhaustion of never being safe. Then we prepare, she said. And somewhere below them in the valley, men gathered and planned, counting the price on her head and wondering how much fight a mountain man would put up for a woman he barely knew. They would learn the answer soon enough. The mountains held their breath, waiting for the storm that was already building on the horizon. The days after Garrus's visit carried a weight that settled over the valley like early frost. Caleb moved through his routines with the precision of a man who had seen war and understood preparation as the difference between survival and massacre. Grace watched him transform from solitary mountain man into something else, something harder and more deliberate. A soldier's mind awakening from 9 years of voluntary sleep. He started with the cabin itself, walking the perimeter with eyes that cataloged every weakness. The door, solid as it was, could be reinforced. The windows, small enough to defend, needed shutters that could stop bullets rather than just wind. The roof required checking for loose boards that might betray position during a siege. Grace found him on the third morning after the threat, marking measurements on fresh-cut timber with a piece of charcoal. You were military. It wasn't a question. Caleb glanced up from his work, reading the certainty in her voice. Union Army, scout for Sherman's Western campaign. He returned to his marking, the confession delivered without pride or shame. Long time ago. But you remember. Some things you don't forget. How to stay alive when people want you dead tops the list. She knelt beside him, studying the timber with new eyes. What are you building? Crossbeams for the door. When they come, and they will come, that door needs to hold against battering and bullets both. He set down the charcoal and met her gaze directly. I need to teach you defensive positions, escape routes, where to shoot from it if we are separated. You think it will come to that? I think we prepare for the worst and hope for less. That's how you survive. So they worked. Grace proved surprisingly capable, her hands remembering labor from a childhood she rarely spoke about. She held timber while he hammered past him nails with the efficiency of someone who understood rhythm and cooperation. They stacked firewood against the cabin walls, creating layers of insulation and barrier. They positioned weapons at strategic points throughout the single-room rifle by the door pistol, near the window knife, within reach of the sleeping area. On the 5th day, she finally told him about the farm. I grew up in western Pennsylvania. My father believed daughters should know how to work as hard as sons. Her hands moved steadily as she helped him reinforce a window shutter. We had 40 acres, corn, wheat, some livestock. I could plow a field before I turned 12. What happened to the farm? Father died when I was 15. Fever took him in 3 days. Mother tried to keep it going, but the work was too much. We sold it and moved to Boston to family who had money and respectability. She paused, the hammer still in her hand. Mother died 2 years later. I joined the convent at 22 thinking I was called. Now I think I was just looking for somewhere to belong that didn't require me to remember what I'd lost. Caleb accepted the story without comment, understanding that some pain needed speaking and some needed silence. He simply nodded and returned to his work, the gesture somehow conveying more acceptance than words could manage. By the second week, the cabin had become a fortress, not impenetrable but defensible. Caleb shifted his focus to supplies, to the mathematics of surviving winter while under potential siege. They would need meat and lots of it. The elk came down from the high country as the first serious snows approached, seeking lower elevations where forage remained accessible. Caleb and Grace tracked a small herd for 2 days, moving with a patience that surprised her. She had expected hunting to be violent and quick. Instead, it was meditation and silence, reading signs in broken branches and displaced stones. When the shot came clean and certain, dropping a mature bull with one bullet through the heart, Grace felt something complicated twist in her chest. Death for survival. Taking life to preserve life. The theological implications would have troubled Sister Grace of the Order of Mercy. They troubled Grace Marlowe less than she expected. Can you help with the butchering? She looked at Caleb, then at the fallen elk, then at her own hands. Hands that had held rosaries and bandaged wounds and signed documents of eternal commitment. Hands that would now learn to separate meat from bone. Teach me. He did with the same patient precision he brought to everything. She learned to feel, to dress, game, to work efficiently while respecting the animal that had died. Her hesitation faded as necessity overrode squeamishness. This was survival stripped of romantic notions and philosophical debate. In the smokehouse later, as they worked side by side, rendering fat and preserving meat, Grace spoke thoughts that had been building for days. They killed Father Benedict first. He was praying when the bullet hit him. I watched him fall, watched him try to finish his prayer even as he died. Her hands kept working the repetitive motion, allowing the words to flow. Sister Agnes tried to run. They caught her within 50 yards. Sister Catherine fought. They beat her for it before they killed her. Caleb listened without interrupting, his own hands steady on the work. I ran too. Into the trees, into the rocks. I heard them laughing behind me. One of them said, "Let her run makes the catch more fun." She paused, muscle memory carrying her through the pause. When they caught me, the first thing one of them said was, "Chua doesn't hear you out here, sister." And I realized he was right. All my prayers, all my faith in God was silent when it mattered most. Or maybe God was there in the fact you survived when the others didn't. Grace looked at him sharply. You believe that? I don't know what I believe about God anymore. Caleb's honesty came without apology. My father preached a God of rules and punishment. The war showed me a God who either didn't care or couldn't stop what men did to each other. Out here I found something else. Not God in churches and scripture, but something in the way mountains stand and seasons turn and life persists despite everything trying to end it. That sounds like faith. Maybe, or maybe it's just stubbornness with better vocabulary. She almost smiled. My father used to say that God gave us hands so we wouldn't just pray, we'd work. That faith without labor was just noise. Your father sounds like he was a wise man. He was, and he taught me to shoot before I could read Latin. The admission came with something like pride. Said women needed to defend themselves because the world wouldn't always send protection. Caleb studied her with new respect. He wasn't wrong. Can you still shoot? I don't know, it's been more than a decade. We'll find out tomorrow. They did. And Caleb discovered that Grace Marlowe had a steady hand and a sharp eye, gifts that muscle memory had preserved through years of disuse. She was an expert, but she was competent, and competence could mean the difference between living and dying. Their partnership shifted that day. Not protector and protected anymore, but something closer to equals. Two people learning to trust each other's capabilities because survival demanded nothing less. November brought the storm they had both been dreading and needing in equal measure. It announced itself with a stillness that made the mountains hold their breath, a pressure in the air that spoke of violence building beyond the visible horizon. Caleb recognized the signs before the first snowflake fell, the way the birds went quiet, the nervous stamping of the horses. The particular quality of light that preceded mountain blizzards, a gray gold that painted the world in shades of warning. This one's bad. He stood on the cabin porch reading the sky like a familiar text. Could last a week or more. They moved with coordinated efficiency, bringing the horses into the barn, securing everything that could blow away or freeze. Grace filled every container they owned with water from the creek, knowing that once the storm hit, leaving the cabin would be impossible. Caleb stacked extra firewood within arm's reach of the door, enough to keep them warm for days without venturing outside. By late afternoon, the first snow began. Soft flakes at first, almost gentle, but Caleb knew better. Within an hour, the wind picked up, turning snowfall into a horizontal assault. Within 2 hours, visibility dropped to nothing. Within 3, the cabin became their entire world. The temperature plummeted. Grace felt it in the way the walls seemed to draw inward, in the way her breath showed even near the fire. Caleb moved the cot closer to the hearth, a practical decision that required no discussion. Warmth mattered more than the careful distance they had maintained. He still planned to sleep on the floor in his bedroll, but the cold made even that compromise dangerous. They needed to share the space near the fire, needed to pool their resources against the storm, trying to kill them through walls and windows. The first day passed in relative silence. They tended the fire, ate simple meals of preserved meat and hardtack, listened to the wind scream its fury at everything that dared to exist. Grace found herself grateful for the storm in a way that surprised her. Out there in the whiteout, Drummond's men couldn't reach them. The siege they faced came from nature rather than human cruelty, and somehow that felt cleaner. The second day brought restlessness. The cabin, adequate for one person living alone, felt smaller, with 2 people trapped inside. They moved around each other with careful choreography, maintaining space that was becoming increasingly precious and difficult. The third day, Grace asked him to read to her. "The Bible's the only book I have." "I know, read it anyway." So he did, choosing Psalms because they required less explanation than Leviticus and less optimism than Proverbs. His voice, rough from disuse, found rhythm in the ancient poetry. Grace closed her eyes and listened, surprised by how different scripture sounded in his voice compared to Father Benedict's formal recitations. The fourth day, she taught him Latin. Small phrases at first, translations of the Psalms he had been reading. He learned quickly, his mind still sharp despite years of deliberate isolation. They found comfort in the academic exercise, in the way language could fill hours that otherwise dragged with dangerous slowness. The fifth day, he taught her mountain lore, how to read weather and cloud formations, how to track game by the age of droppings, how to find water when everything looked the same. Knowledge that might save her life if she ever found herself alone in this wilderness. They were building something between them, invisible and undeniable. Not quite friendship, not quite something more, but a connection that grew stronger each day they survived together. On the evening of the 6th day, with the storm showing no signs of weakening, Caleb read Psalm 23 at Grace's request. His voice caught at, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," the words hitting something deep and unresolved. He stopped reading, staring at the page as if the text had betrayed him. "My father's favorite passage." The words came out rough. "He read it at my mother's funeral, read it again when I left for the war, said it would keep me safe if I kept faith." Did it? Kept me alive. Don't know if that's the same as safe. Grace waited, sensing there was more. Caleb set the Bible aside and stared into the fire, his profile sharp against the flickering light. "I killed a man after the war ended, not in battle, after surrender." The confession hung between them, heavy as the snow outside. Grace didn't speak, didn't move, just listened with the complete attention that invited truth. "We found him in a farmhouse outside Atlanta. He was Confederate cavalry, but he'd surrendered, same as everyone else. Supposed to be safe, supposed to go home and rebuild." Caleb's hands clenched and released the only sign of emotion in his otherwise steady voice. "But we found what he'd done. Found the bodies. Women, children. Things I won't describe because speaking them makes them real again." "What did you do?" "I took his gun, walked him outside in front of my unit, put the barrel against his head and pulled the trigger." His eyes stayed fixed on the fire. Didn't ask permission. Didn't consult anyone. Just executed him like you'd execute a rabid dog. "Your commanding officer?" "Looked the other way. Most of the men did. But word got back to my father somehow." Now Caleb did look at her, his face showing pain that hadn't diminished in 9 years. He wrote me a letter, said I'd damn my soul. That vengeance belonged to God alone and I'd committed murder in the eyes of the Lord. What did you write back? That some men forfeit God's mercy. That if the Lord wanted to judge me for stopping a monster, I'd accept that judgment. But I wouldn't apologize for doing what needed doing when God stayed silent. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Grace absorbed the story, turning it over in her mind against her own theology, her own understanding of right and wrong. Do you regret it? Caleb considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that evil like that exists in the world. I regret that my father and I never spoke again. He paused, then added quietly, but I don't regret pulling that trigger. And I don't know if that makes me righteous or damned. Grace reached across the small space between them and placed her hand over his. The gesture was simple contact without demand, comfort without judgment. Then you're more righteous than you believe because you carry the weight of it. Monsters don't lose sleep over necessary violence. They sat like that for a long moment, hands touching both, staring into flames that asked no questions and offered no answers. On the night of the 6th day, the storm intensified beyond anything Grace had experienced. The wind didn't just blow, it attacked, slamming against the cabin with force that made the walls shudder. Snow found impossible entry points, creating small drifts in corners despite Caleb's careful construction. The temperature dropped so low that frost formed on the inside of the windows, and the fire seemed to struggle against cold that wanted everything dead. Grace tried to sleep, but couldn't. Every howl of wind triggered memories she'd spent weeks trying to suppress. The sound of the wagon train attack, the screams of Sister Catherine, the laughter of men who found sport in terror. Her breathing quickened shallow and fast, and she felt her chest tighten with panic that had nothing to do with present danger and everything to do with past horror. Caleb heard the change. He'd been lying in his bedroll on the floor, but he sat up slowly, making noise so she'd know he was moving. Grace? She couldn't answer. The panic had her throat now, had her lungs, had everything that made breathing possible. Grace, I'm going to sit beside you. Just sit. Nothing else. Is that all right? She managed a nod, though she wasn't sure he could see it in the dim firelight. But he must have, because the cot shifted as he settled onto its edge, close enough that she could feel his warmth, but not so close that she felt trapped. Tell me about Pennsylvania. His voice stayed low and steady, a counterpoint to the screaming wind. Tell me about the farm. I can't. The words came out strangled. Then I'll talk. You just breathe. Can you do that? Another nod. He began speaking, his voice finding a rhythm that had nothing to do with the storm and everything to do with creating space for her to remember how to exist without fear. There's a valley 3 peaks north of here where the aspens grow so thick you can't see the ground in autumn. Just gold, everywhere you look like God spilled sunlight and forgot to clean it up. I found it my 2nd year out here, and I go back every fall just to remember that the world can be beautiful for no reason at all. Grace's breathing slowed slightly. Caleb kept talking. And there's a lake up near the snow line that's so clear you can see 40 feet down. Trout in there big as your arm, smart enough they probably got names for us. I spent a week trying to catch one once, and when I finally did, it looked at me with these old eyes like it knew something I didn't. I threw it back. Another breath deeper this time, the panic loosening its grip. Stars up here aren't like stars down in the valleys. They're closer, brighter, so thick you can't count them, even if you spent a lifetime trying. Sometimes I lie out on clear nights and just watch them, thinking about how small I am and how little my problems matter to something that big and old and patient. Grace found her voice rough but functional. You sound like a poet. Poet's just someone who pays attention and remembers. Not much else to do with all this silence except notice things. The wind hammered the cabin again, but Grace didn't flinch this time. She was focused on Caleb's voice, on the steady presence beside her that asked nothing and offered everything. Better getting there. And they sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm try to break their shelter and fail. Then, without planning it, without thinking about vows or propriety or consequences, Grace let her head rest against Caleb's shoulder. He went very still. She felt him stop breathing for just a moment, felt the question in his tension. Is this all right? She whispered. Yeah. The word came out rough. Yeah, this is all right. So they sat like that, her head on his shoulder, his hand coming up slowly to rest gently on her arm. Not romantic, not sexual, just two people finding comfort in contact that didn't hurt. For Grace, it was the first time in months that touch had meant safety instead of violence. For Caleb, it was the first time in years that isolation had felt like a choice rather than a sentence. You're safe, he said quietly. I promise you're safe. I know. And for the first time since the massacre, she believed it completely. The storm broke on this ninth day, revealing a world transformed by snow. Drifts reached halfway up the cabin walls, and the valley stretched white and pristine under a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Caleb and Grace dug themselves out slowly, their bodies stiff from days of confinement, but their spirits oddly lighter. The peace lasted exactly 2 hours. Caleb saw the tracks first while checking the perimeter. Boot prints circling the cabin at a distance made during the storm, and partially filled but still visible to someone who knew what to look for. Someone had been watching them, waiting out the blizzard at lower elevation, checking to see if they'd survived. They came during the storm. He knelt in the snow reading the prints like text. 2 men, maybe 3. Stayed back far enough that we wouldn't hear them close enough to keep watch. Grace felt her newfound calm evaporate. Why not attack when we were trapped? Because they're smart. Storm would have killed them same as us. But now they know we're alive. Know we're running low on supplies after 9 days locked in. Know we're vulnerable. He pointed down the valley where even from this distance, smoke was visible, rising from multiple fires. A camp, not just passing through, waiting. That evening brought a visitor, not Garrus or Drummond's men, but Dutch Keller, the neighboring mountain man Caleb occasionally traded with. He rode in under a white flag made from a torn shirt tied to a branch, but his face carried bad news, like a pack full of stones. Harrison's sister. Caleb met him at the tree line, rifle ready, but not raised. Dutch wasn't expecting company. Not a social call. The older man dismounted, moving with the stiffness of someone who'd been riding in cold. Drummond set up camp down at Porter's with 8 men, and word is he's bringing 5 more, including himself, within the week. How much is the bounty now? $100 for the woman alive, 50 for you dead or alive. Dutch spat into the snow. Every drifter and bounty hunter from here to Denver's hearing about it. You're not just fighting Drummond's crew, you're fighting economics. Grace stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. Why are you telling us this? Dutch looked at her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Because Mountain Code says when a man offers sanctuary, you defend that sanctuary. Harrison sheltered you. That makes it our business. Our business. Got Big John and Henry 2 Crows willing to stand with you. Maybe 1 or 2 others if I ask right. He turned back to Caleb. You're good in a fight, Harrison. We all know your reputation from the war, but 13 men against 4 is bad odds even for you. Caleb nodded slowly, accepting the math without flinching. What's Drummond waiting for? For you to run, or for Winter to weaken you enough that the fight's easier? Man's patient when money's involved. Dutch glanced at the cabin, at the smoke rising from its chimney. You sure she's worth dying for? I'm sure I won't let them take her. The old mounted man grunted, the sound of someone who'd expected that answer. Then we prepare. I'll bring John and Henry tomorrow. We'll fortify what we can and plan for what we can't stop. After Dutch left, Grace and Caleb stood in the snow, watching the smoke signals rise from the valley below. She spoke first. You could still leave. Take me to the nearest town, hand me over to the marshal, walk away clean. Could, won't. Why, you barely know me. This isn't your fight. Caleb turned to face her fully, his eyes carrying that absolute certainty she'd come to recognize. You asked me once why I bought you. I didn't have a good answer then. I do now. What changed? You did. Not who you are, but how I see you. He paused, choosing words carefully. I spent 9 years up here, hiding from the world because I believed I'd used up my chance at being good. Believed that killing that man being right but doing wrong meant I didn't deserve connection or care or anything that looked like redemption. And now I think maybe the universe or God or whatever runs things gave me one more chance to stand between evil and someone who doesn't deserve it. And if I walk away from that, If I let them take you because it's easier or safer, then I'm exactly the man my father said I was. Grace felt tears threaten, but she blinked them back. This could get you killed. Lots of things could get me killed. At least this one means something. They prepared for war over the next 3 days. Dutch returned with Big John, a former buffalo hunter whose size matched his name, and Henry, Two Crows, a Shoshone tracker who'd chosen mountain life over reservation existence. Together, the four men transformed the cabin into a fortress, while Grace learned the things she'd need to know to fight instead of hide. Caleb taught her defensive positions, where to shoot from for best coverage, how to reload quickly under stress. Big John showed her how to move between cover without exposing herself to crossfire. Henry demonstrated silent communication hand signals that would let them coordinate without giving away positions. She proved an apt student, her farm background and natural competence merging with desperation to create something formidable. By the third day, Caleb looked at her and saw not a woman who needed protection, but a partner who could hold a line when hell came calling. "Your father was right to teach you to shoot," he said after watching her put 3 bullets in a target at 50 yards. He said the frontier doesn't care about gender when it comes to survival. Only competence matters. He wasn't wrong. That night, alone in the cabin while the mountain men slept in the barn, Grace examined her reflection in Caleb's small mirror. The woman looking back bore little resemblance to Sister Grace of the Order of Mercy. That woman had been soft-protected, certain in her faith and her calling. This woman had hard eyes and capable hands, had killed to survive and would kill again if necessary. She had broken her vow of peace. She would break others before this was over. The question was whether she could live with the breaking or whether it would destroy something essential in her soul. Caleb entered quietly, reading her expression with the accuracy of someone who'd spent days learning her moods. Second thoughts. Constant thoughts. About who I was and who I'm becoming. Those don't have to be enemies, don't they? Everything I swore to be, I'm abandoning. Everything I promised God, I'm breaking. He moved to stand beside her, both of them reflected in the small mirror. Or maybe you're keeping promises you didn't know you made. To yourself, to survival, to choosing life even when death would be easier. She turned to face him directly. You sound very certain for someone who doesn't know what he believes about God. I'm certain about you. That's enough for now. The attack came at dawn 3 days later, sudden and coordinated in a way that spoke of military planning. 4 men hit the cabin from different angles simultaneously, their goal clearly to overwhelm defenses through speed and numbers. Grace was at the window position when the first bullet shattered the morning quiet. She returned fire without thinking, muscle memory taking over, and had the satisfaction of seeing one attacker die for cover. Beside her, Caleb worked his rifle with mechanical precision, not wasting ammunition, but making every shot count. From the barn, Big John's buffalo gun boomed like thunder, each shot capable of dropping a man or a horse with equal efficiency. Henry Two Crows moved between positions like a ghost, his smaller caliber rifle picking off targets with surgical accuracy. The attackers had expected resistance. They hadn't expected competence. Within 5 minutes, one man lay dead in the snow. 2 others were wounded badly enough to retreat, and the fourth had decided that $100 wasn't worth dying for. But the victory came with a cost. A bullet had found Caleb not killing, but definitely hitting. Grace saw him stumble, saw blood darken his shirt, and her heart stopped. How bad? Just a graze. Keep shooting. It wasn't just a graze. She could see that from the way he held his left side, from the tightness around his eyes. But he was right that they needed to keep fighting, so she turned back to her window and tried not to think about the spreading red stain. The attackers regrouped at the tree line, and Grace watched them through her rifle sights. One man was arguing with the others, pointing back at the cabin, clearly wanting to press the attack. Pete Garris. She recognized him, even at this distance, recognized the stubborn greed that wouldn't accept defeat. She took aim, her finger finding the trigger, with the sureness of practice. One shot could end him. One shot could eliminate a threat and possibly prevent future attacks. Her vows of peace whispered in the back of her mind, growing fainter each day, but not yet silent. Then Garris turned, and she saw him raise his rifle, saw him aim not at her window, but at the barn where Big John was reloading. No hesitation, no warning, just murder for hire. Grace fired. The shot took Garris in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him into the snow. Not a kill shot, but enough to end his part in the fight. The other men grabbed him and dragged him toward their horses, their retreat turning into full rout. "They're running," Big John's voice carried from the barn, triumphant and relieved in equal measure. But Grace didn't feel triumphant. She stared at her hands, at the rifle they held, at the reality of what she'd just done. She had shot a man, not in wild panic or desperate self-defense, but with careful aim and deliberate intent. Sister Grace would have been horrified. Grace Marlowe felt only a hollow certainty that she would do it again if necessary. "Grace," Caleb's voice came from behind her, strained with pain but steady. "I need help with this." She turned and saw him leaning against the table, his shirt soaked through with blood that looked darker than it should. The graze wasn't a graze at all. The bullet had carved a furrow along his ribs deep enough to be serious. Her medical training, limited but present, took over. She moved him to the cot, cut away his shirt, assessed the damage with the hands that stayed steady, despite the fear screaming in her head. The wound needed cleaning and binding needed attention that she could provide if she didn't fall apart. "Talk to me." She worked as she spoke, cleaning the wound with whiskey that made him hiss through clenched teeth. "Keep talking, so I know you're not going into shock." "What do you want me to say? Anything. Tell me about those aspen trees again, the ones that look like spilled sunlight." So he did, his voice rougher than normal but present and aware. He talked about trees and stars and the way the mountains looked in summer when wildflowers turned the meadows into paintings. He talked while she cleaned and bandaged, while she checked for signs of serious bleeding or internal damage, while she tried not to think about how close the bullet had come to killing him. When she finished, they sat in silence, broken only by the sound of the men in the barn celebrating their survival. Grace's hands were covered in Caleb's blood, her dress stained with it, and something in her chest felt broken in a way that had nothing to do with physical wounds. "I shot him." The words came out flat. "I aimed and I fired and I hit exactly where I intended." "You saved Big John's life." "I broke my vows, all of them. Poverty, chastity, obedience, peace. I violated every promise I made to Con in the church." Caleb reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. When she didn't, he took her blood-stained hands in his. "You saved a life. That's not sin, Grace. That's the most holy thing a person can do." "I don't know what I am anymore." The confession came out broken. "Not a nun, not innocent, not anything I recognize. You're Grace, the woman who survived when others didn't. The woman who learned to fight when fighting was the only option. The woman who chose life over death, even when death would have been easier." He squeezed her hands gently. "That's enough. That's more than enough." She looked at him, this mountain man who'd killed in war and killed in peace, who'd hidden from the world but couldn't hide from his own conscience, who saw her not as property or salvation, but simply as a person worth defending. And something in her broke open, spilling out grief and fear and exhaustion she'd been carrying since the massacre. She wept, then deep shaking sobs that had been building for months. Caleb pulled her close, ignoring the pain in his side, letting her cry into his chest, while her hands clutched his shoulders like he was the only solid thing in a world that kept trying to destroy her. "You're all right," he said quietly over and over. "You're going to be all right." And for the first time since she'd watched Father Benedict die, Grace let herself believe that might be true. Outside, Dutch Keller stood guard, watching the tree line where Garrison and his men had retreated. He turned to Big John, who'd come out of the barn to check the perimeter. "Drummond's going to come himself now. Lost too many men to let this stand." Big John nodded grimly. "How long you figure?" "Week, maybe 2. He'll want to bring enough force that there's no question of outcome." Harrison knows. Question is whether knowing makes a difference." They stood in silence, two men who'd seen enough violence to understand what was coming. Inside the cabin, they could hear muffled sounds of grief and comfort, of two people finding each other in the wreckage of everything they'd lost. "She's tougher than she looks," Big John observed. "So's he. But tough only gets you so far when you're outnumbered and outgunned. Then we make sure they're not as outnumbered as Drummond thinks." Dutch smiled, the expression carrying no humor. "You got more friends willing to die for a principle. Don't need friends, just need men who understand that some fights matter more than the winning of them." The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning gun smoke and revealing a valley that looked peaceful despite the violence it had just witnessed. But peace, both men knew, was temporary. Storm clouds were gathering again, human this time, and when they broke, blood would water the snow. Inside the cabin, Grace finally pulled away from Caleb's chest, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Her face was blotchy and swollen, her breathing still hitched, but her eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there before. If Drummond comes with his full force, we can't win. Probably not. So why are we staying? Caleb looked at her, really looked, seeing past the nun's habit she'd abandoned and the survival instincts she'd acquired down to the person underneath all of it. Because running means they win. Means every woman who comes after you gets treated like property because there's profit in it and no consequence for taking it. He paused, then added quietly, and because I'm tired of running from fights that matter. Grace nodded slowly, understanding settling over her like snow. Then we make them pay for every inch. Every inch, he agreed. And somewhere down the valley, Wade Drummond counted his dead and wounded calculated costs against profits and decided that principle was worth teaching, even if it required killing everyone on that mountain to do it. The siege was coming, not might be, not could be, but was. Inevitable as winter, certain as death approaching, with the patient malice of men who knew time was on their side. Grace and Caleb had perhaps 2 weeks to prepare for the end of the world as they knew it. They would need every second. 3 days after the attack, Caleb's wound had stopped bleeding, but the pain remained a constant reminder etched in the way he moved and the tightness around his eyes. Grace changed his bandages twice daily, her hands steady despite the fear that lived in her chest like a permanent resident. The bullet had carved deep, missing vital organs by margins too small for comfort, and infection remained a threat that stalked them as surely as Drummond's men. She found him on the morning of the 4th day, standing at the cabin window, despite her orders to rest, staring down the valley where smoke still rose from the camp below. You should be lying down. Been lying down for 3 days. Man can only watch ceiling boards for so long before he starts seeing patterns that aren't there. Grace moved beside him, following his gaze. The camp had grown. More fires, more movement, the accumulation of force that spoke of coming violence. Tell me about your family. Everything. Caleb glanced at her, surprised by the directness. Why now? Because if we're going to die together, I want to know who you were before you became who you are. He was quiet for a long moment, then began speaking in a voice that carried old wounds never quite healed. My father was Reverend Josiah Harrison, circuit preacher in Missouri, the kind of man who believed God spoke directly to him and everyone else needed to listen harder. Caleb's fingers traced patterns on the windowsill, unconscious and repetitive. My mother died when I was 10. Fever took her in the spring, and father remarried by autumn. Said the Lord had provided a helpmate, that grief was selfish when work needed doing. Did you accept her? I was 10. I accepted what I was told to accept. Bitterness crept into his voice. But I never called her mother, and she never pretended to care whether I did. Grace waited, sensing there was more. Caleb continued, the words coming faster now, like poison draining from an old wound. Father preached hellfire and damnation. Not the gentle shepherd guiding lost sheep, but the wrathful judge burning the wicked. I grew up believing God was someone to fear, not love, that every pleasure was suspect and every question was rebellion. So you questioned everything. Why did God let mother die? Why did suffering fall on the righteous same as the wicked? Why did prayer sometimes go unanswered and sometimes get answered in ways worse than silence? He shook his head. Father said doubt was the devil's tool. I said doubt was the mind working the way God built it to work. We fought about it for years. The war was your escape. Thought it would be. Turned out war just proved Father right about human evil. Caleb's hand moved unconsciously to his side, to the fresh wound that echoed older scars. I enlisted at 17, lied about my age, ended up as a scout because I could track and shoot and keep my mouth shut when officers needed quiet. You saw terrible things. Saw men do things to each other that made me question whether we deserve salvation at all. His voice dropped lower, and then I became one of those men. Grace knew what was coming, but she let him tell it at his own pace. After Appomattox, after Lee surrendered, we found a Confederate cavalry officer in a farmhouse outside Atlanta. War was over for everyone else, but not for him, apparently. Caleb's jaw tightened. He'd killed a family. Mother, father, 3 children. did things to them before he killed them, things that don't deserve words. How did you know it was him? He was still there, still covered in their blood, laughing about it with two other men who'd helped. Caleb turned to face Grace fully. I took his pistol, walked him outside, put the gun to his head in front of my entire unit, and pulled the trigger. Then I shot the other two. Didn't ask permission, didn't consult anyone, just executed them. And your father found out. My commanding officer wrote him a letter thinking he'd be proud his son had stopped monsters. Caleb's laugh held no humor. Father wrote back to me, said I'd damn my soul for all eternity. That vengeance belonged to God alone, and I'd committed murder in the eyes of the Lord. That the war had made me exactly what he'd always feared, a man who put his own judgment above divine will. What did you say? I told him some men forfeit God's mercy through their actions, that if the Almighty wanted to judge me for stopping evil when he stayed silent, I'd accept that judgment. But I wouldn't apologize for doing what needed doing when prayer wasn't enough. Grace absorbed this understanding, settling over her like morning light. And you never spoke again. Packed my things that night. Came west as far as the mountains would take me. Been here 9 years, and I don't know if my father's alive or dead. Don't know if he ever regretted his words or if he's still certain I'm hellbound. Do you regret what you did killing those men? Caleb met her eyes with an honesty that held no apology. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that evil like that exists. I regret losing my father over it. He paused. But I don't regret pulling that trigger. And I don't know if that makes me righteous or damned. It makes you human. Grace's voice carried conviction she'd found somewhere in the weeks of survival. Your father preached a God of rules and punishment. But maybe God is also found in the choice to stop evil when no one else will. Maybe righteousness isn't about following every rule perfectly. Maybe it's about doing the hardest thing when it's the right thing. You sound like you've given this some thought. I've had time to think about a lot of things. She moved closer to him, close enough that she could see the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines that pain and time had carved into his face. I need to tell you something about why I really joined the order. Now it was Caleb's turn to listen. Grace gathered her thoughts, surprised by how much she wanted to tell him, how safe confession felt in his presence. I told you my mother died 2 years after we moved to Boston. What I didn't say was that I spent those 2 years watching her fade. Not from illness, but from grief. She missed the farm, missed my father, missed having purpose beyond being decorative in someone else's parlor. She died of heartbreak. She died of having no place to belong. Grace's hands twisted together, old pains surfacing. And I was terrified I'd end up the same way. So when the convent offered to take me, I said yes. Not because I felt called by God, but because I was running from being lost. That's honest. It's more than honest. It's the truth I've been hiding from myself for years. She took a shaky breath. I took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but they felt like refuge, not commitment, like walls I could hide behind instead of a life I was choosing. And the missionary work, another escape, from the doubts that kept growing, from the questions I couldn't answer, from the creeping certainty that I'd made my vows for the wrong reasons. Grace turned to face him fully. When the wagon train was attacked, when I watched Father Benedict die, still praying when I heard those men laugh and say Chua couldn't hear me out there, part of me wondered if God had ever heard me at all. Caleb reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. But you're closer to God here than you ever were in the convent. How did you know? Because I see it in you, the way you move through the world now, present and aware, and fighting for things that matter. That's faith, Grace. Not the kind that hides in buildings and rules, but the kind that faces hard truths and chooses right anyway. Tears pricked her eyes. I'm terrified. Of what? Of this, of you, of what I'm feeling. The words tumbled out faster now, honesty becoming confession. I'm falling in love with you, Caleb. Maybe I've been falling since you traded those hides without expecting anything in return. And it terrifies me because loving you means admitting everything I built my life around was a lie. The silence that followed felt eternal. Caleb's hand tightened on hers, and she watched his face work through emotions that had no easy names. "I fell weeks ago," he said finally, his voice rough. "Been trying to deny it, trying to tell myself you were just someone I helped, someone passing through. But that was always a lie. What do we do?" "I don't know. All I know is that if Drummond comes and we don't survive, I'll regret not telling you this. That you're the first person in 9 years who made me think maybe I'm not meant to die alone on this mountain. That maybe redemption isn't something you earn through suffering, but something you find when you stop running from the people who see you clearly and don't turn away." Grace felt something break open in her chest, fear and hope tangled so tightly she couldn't separate them. "I don't know what comes next." "Neither do I, but whatever it is, we face it together." They stood like that, hands joined the space between them, charged with things not yet spoken but deeply felt. Outside, the valley waited with all its threats and promises. But inside the cabin, two broken people had found something neither expected and both desperately needed. The sound of hoofbeats broke the moment. Caleb moved to the window. His soldier's instincts never fully asleep, and Grace followed. Dutch Keller rode into the clearing, but his expression carried news that turned Caleb's shoulders rigid. "He's here," Drummond himself with 9 men. "Set up camp at the creek bend, close enough we can see their fires from the ridge." Caleb absorbed this without visible reaction. "How long before they move?" "Sent me with an offer. You and the woman come down peaceful, he lets you both walk away. Refuse and he burns you out, kills you, slow, takes her anyway. Deadline, 48 hours. Grace stepped forward. "Tell him we refuse." Dutch looked at her with something like respect. "You understand what that means. These aren't bandits looking for quick profit anymore. Drummond's personal now. He'll make you suffer for the embarrassment. Then he'll have to catch us first." After Dutch left to deliver their answer, Caleb turned to Grace. "Last chance to change your mind. I can get you to Silver Creek, hand you to the marshal, let the law sort this. The law didn't protect me before. It won't protect me now." Her voice carried absolute certainty. "We stand here together or we don't stand at all." That night, Big John and Henry Two Crows joined them in the cabin maps, spread across the table positions marked and remarked as they planned for a battle. They knew they couldn't win, but refused to avoid. The mathematics were brutal. 9 attackers against 4 defenders, with terrain offering some advantage, but not enough. "We hold the cabin as long as possible." Caleb outlined his finger-tracing defensive positions. Grace takes the window position with the rifle. Big John in the barn with the buffalo gun. Henry mobile between positions. "I'll hold the door." And when they breach, Big John's question held no judgment, just professional assessment. "We make them pay for every inch. Make it cost enough that the next time someone thinks about trafficking women, they remember what it costs to try taking one from here." Henry Two Crows nodded slowly. "Good death beats bad life." They worked through scenarios until the candle burned low, planning for contingencies and calculating angles of fire. When the others finally retreated to the barn for a few hours of sleep before the coming storm, Grace and Caleb remained alone in the cabin one last time. "I should tell you something." Grace's voice broke the silence. "If we survive this, when we survive this, I'm renouncing my vows, formally, publicly." Caleb looked up from cleaning his rifle. "That's not something to decide under duress." "I'm not. I decided weeks ago, maybe the first night you left me alone in this cabin, and I realized safety didn't require submission." She moved to stand before him. "I've been terrified to admit it, terrified what it means about who I am and who I'm choosing to become. But I'm done being afraid of choosing my own life." "What will you do after, I mean?" "Stay with you, if you'll have me." Caleb set the rifle aside carefully, his movements deliberate. "Grace, I'm a broken man hiding in the mountains. I have nothing to offer except this cabin and a life that's more work than comfort. You have integrity, courage, kindness. You see people as people, not property or pawns." She knelt before him, taking his scarred hands in hers. "That's everything. That's more than everything. I'll probably die tomorrow. Then we die together." She squeezed his hands. "But if we live, I want to live as Grace Harrison, not Sister Grace, who was too afraid to admit what she really wanted." Caleb pulled her up slowly, mindful of his healing wound, until they stood facing each other with nothing between them but breath and honesty. His hand came up to cup her face thumb, brushing across her cheekbone with a gentleness that made her throat tighten. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know something." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "You're the bravest person I've ever met. Not because you survived, but because you chose to keep fighting when giving up would have been easier. You're remarkable, Grace Marlowe, and I'm honored to stand with you." She rose on her toes, closing the final distance between them, and kissed him. The kiss was tender and desperate in equal measure, full of everything they hadn't said and might never get the chance to speak. Caleb's arms came around her, carefully holding her like she was precious and breakable and fierce all at once. Grace felt tears on her cheeks and didn't know if they were hers or his or both. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Grace pressed her forehead to his. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I choose this. I choose you. I choose you too." They held each other in the firelight, two people who had found love in the worst possible circumstances and refused to apologize for it. Outside, the night deepened toward dawn. Inside, they memorized the feeling of being held without fear of choosing connection, despite every reason not to, of believing that love might be worth dying for. When morning came, painted in shades of gold and crimson that seemed too beautiful for what they promised they would face Drummond's men together. But tonight they had this, each other, the truth finally spoken, and the absolute certainty that some things were worth fighting for even when the fight looked impossible. Grace woke before dawn to find Caleb already dressed and armed, standing at the window with the stillness of someone preparing for war. She rose quietly, pulling on the worn pants and shirt that had become her uniform, and moved to stand beside him. "They're coming at dawn. You can see them gathering at the creek." She followed his gaze and saw movement in the gray light, the systematic preparation of men who knew violence professionally. 9 men. Drummond at their center, his fine coat visible, even at this distance. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Terrified, but fear means you're alive enough to care about staying that way." Dutch Big John and Henry appeared from the barn, each man checking weapons with the practiced efficiency of veterans. They'd spent the night in shifts watching the camp below, waiting for movement that would signal the attack. "They'll come hard and fast," Big John predicted, loading his buffalo gun with rounds that could drop a horse. "Drummond wants this over quickly. Then we make quick expensive." Caleb's voice carried command authority Grace had never heard before the soldier underneath the mountain man finally surfacing. "Henry, you're mobile. Hit them from angles they don't expect. John Barn position maximum damage. Dutch, your backup wherever the line weakens. Grace window position, controlled fire, don't waste ammunition." They moved to positions as the sun began its climb above the peaks. Grace settled at the window rifle, rested on the sill, her heart hammering but her hands steady. She could see them clearly now. 9 men spreading out in a loose semicircle, Drummond hanging back while his hired guns took the forward positions. The first shot came from the tree line, a ranging attempt that buried itself in the cabin wall 2 feet from Grace's window. She didn't flinch. She'd learned that flinching didn't stop bullets, only steady aim and faster shooting did. "Hold fire until they're committed," Caleb ordered. "Let them think we're an easy target." The attackers advanced in a rush, trying to cover the open ground before defensive fire could cut them down. It was a valid tactic against 1 or 2 defenders. Against 4 people who knew what they were doing, it was suicide attempting to look like bravery. Now, 4 rifles spoke as one. 2 men went down immediately, dead before they understood their mistake. A third took a round through the leg and collapsed screaming. The others dove for whatever cover they could find, their confidence shattered by the professional response. Big John's buffalo gun boomed, and one of the barn walls splintered behind an attacker who'd thought wood could stop that caliber. It couldn't. The man spun and fell, his rifle discharging into the ground. Henry appeared and disappeared like smoke firing from positions that shouldn't have been possible, his Shoshone tracking skills making him effectively invisible until he chose to be seen. Another attacker fell, clutching a shoulder wound that painted the snow red. But the attackers adapted. They'd brought more men than they needed precisely for this reason, calculating that overwhelming force would eventually overcome skill. They pressed from multiple angles, using their wounded as cover, firing, suppressing volleys that kept defenders pinned. A bullet shattered the window above Grace's head, showering her with glass. She dropped rolled, came up at a different position, and fired twice. One hit, one miss. The hit counted more. Caleb worked his rifle with mechanical precision, each shot carefully aimed, each target selected for maximum impact. He moved between positions with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd fought this kind of battle before reading the foe of combat and responding before attackers realized they'd made themselves vulnerable. Then Grace saw him stumble, not from a hit, but from his previous wound, tearing open under the stress. Blood bloomed fresh on his shirt, and his face went pale. Caleb. I'm fine, keep shooting. He wasn't fine. She could see that from across the room. But he was right that stopping now meant dying, so she turned back to her window and found another target. The battle became chaos. Men shouting, guns firing, the sharp smell of powder smoke mixing with copper blood. Big John took a hit in the arm but kept firing, one-handed, his buffalo gun too heavy to manage properly, but devastating when it connected. Dutch's position in the barn loft gave him angles the attackers hadn't accounted for, and he used them ruthlessly. Henry Two Crows moved through the combat like a ghost, appearing long enough to shoot and disappearing before return of fire could find him. The attackers started shooting at shadows, wasting ammunition on fear instead of targets. But numbers told eventually. 2 attackers made it to the cabin wall, one on each side, trying to force entry through weakness they'd created with concentrated fire. Grace heard them coming and made a decision that would have horrified Sister Grace, but came naturally to who she'd become. She left her window position, moved to the door with Caleb's spare pistol, and waited. When the first man crashed through, she shot him in the chest at point-blank range. He went down hard. The second man froze in shock, and Caleb's rifle spoke from across the room, ending that threat permanently. Outside, Drummond screamed orders, his voice carrying over the gunfire. He'd lost 6 men now, more than half his force, and rage had replaced calculation. He charged toward the cabin himself, firing wildly, his fine coat flapping behind him like judgment personified. Grace took aim through the broken window. Her first shot missed. Her second caught him in the leg, spinning him around. He went down but didn't stay down, crawling toward cover while still trying to shoot. Caleb moved to the door, his rifle raised despite the blood loss making him sway. He had a clear shot at Drummond's back, an execution angle that would end this permanently. Caleb, don't. Grace's voice cut through the chaos. We need him alive. We need witnesses. He hesitated, understanding passing between them. Killing Drummond would solve today's problem, but create tomorrow's. If this ended in massacre rather than justice, they'd be fugitives forever. But if Drummond lived to face consequences, if there were witnesses and law involved, they might actually survive this. Caleb lowered his rifle slightly and fired into the ground near Drummond's head instead. Drop your weapon and surrender, or the next one goes through your skull. Drummond's remaining men, seeing their leader down and their cause lost, threw down their weapons. The sudden silence after sustained gunfire felt almost physical, like pressure releasing from sealed spaces. Grace moved to Caleb as he sagged against the doorframe. His wound had reopened completely, blood soaking through bandages and shirt. She caught him before he fell, lowering him to the ground with strength she didn't know she had. I told you to be careful. I was careful, just not careful enough. His smile was pained but genuine. We won. We survived. That's not always the same thing. Dutch and Big John secured the surviving attackers while Henry checked the perimeter for anyone trying to escape. 3 dead, 4 wounded badly enough to need medical attention, 2 surrendered but uninjured. Drummond lay in the snow, bleeding from his leg and cursing steadily. Grace worked on Caleb's wound with hands that shook now that the fighting was done. The bullet had torn the partially healed tissue, creating damage that would need proper medical care beyond what she could provide with whiskey and thread. You need a doctor. Need to stay conscious first. Then stop bleeding. Working on it. She bandaged him as best she could, knowing it wasn't enough, but not knowing what else to do. They'd survived the battle, but the war was far from over. Wounded needed care, prisoners needed securing, and somewhere down the valley, law would be coming to sort through the wreckage. Marshal Thomas Crawford arrived 2 days later, brought by Henry Two Crows, who'd ridden hard to Silver Creek with news of the battle. The marshal was a weathered man in his mid-40s, carrying authority like a familiar coat, neither comfortable nor unwelcome, but absolutely present. He surveyed the scene with professional detachment. 3 bodies awaiting burial. Drummond and 3 others bandaged and surly. Big John nursing an arm wound. And Caleb, pale from blood loss but conscious, sitting at the cabin table while Grace changed his bandages for the 10th time. Harrison, been a while. Crawford, didn't expect to see you up here. Didn't expect to get reports of a small war in my jurisdiction. The marshal accepted coffee from Grace with a nod of thanks. Want to tell me what happened? So they did. Caleb explained the purchase at Porter's, the threats from Drummond's men, the siege, and the final battle. Grace added details about the wagon train massacre, her time in captivity, the bounty Drummond had placed on her. Dutch and the others corroborated everything, their testimony painting a picture that even the most skeptical lawman would struggle to dismiss. Crawford listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small book he produced from his coat. When they finished, he studied Drummond with the expression of someone seeing exactly what he expected. Wade Drummond, been hearing your name attached to various crimes for 3 years now. Never had enough evidence to bring charges. He turned back to Caleb. Self-defense seems clear enough, but there's complications. What kind of complications? The kind where 9 men came to kill 2 people and ended up dead or captured instead. Territory law requires a formal inquest. He looked at Grace. And the kind where a Catholic nun is living with a man she's not married to in circumstances that certain folks will find scandalous regardless of context. Grace straightened her jaw, setting in a way Caleb had come to recognize as preparation for battle. I'm not living with him. I'm staying here of my own free will until I decide otherwise. That distinction matters to you, might not matter to the church or to people who care about proprieties. Then they can take their concerns up with me directly. Crawford almost smiled. You'll get that chance. You're both coming to Silver Creek. Drummond and his men too. There'll be a town hall inquest and everyone involved will testify. After that, a judge will determine if charges need filing. Are we under arrest? Caleb asked. Protective custody? There's still men out there who might want to collect on Drummond's bounty, and keeping you alive to testify is in everyone's interest. The marshal stood. We leave at first light tomorrow. Gather what you need for a week's stay. That night, lying in Caleb's arms while he slept restlessly from pain and exhaustion, Grace made peace with the choice she'd already committed to. Tomorrow would bring scrutiny and judgment. People would question her virtue, her sanity, her devotion to vows she'd taken in another life. Let them question. She knew her answer. The ride to Silver Creek took 2 days, slowed by wounded and the need to secure prisoners. Grace rode beside Caleb's travois, watching his face for signs of fever or deterioration. The wound was healing, but slowly, and infection remained a constant threat. Silver Creek emerged from the forest like a promise or a threat, depending on perspective. 200 souls making their living from silver mines and the services mines required. A church with a white steeple. A main street with businesses whose false fronts suggested prosperity they hadn't quite achieved. And people. So many people after weeks of isolation, all of them staring as the strange procession rode down the main street. Marshal Crawford housed Caleb and Grace separately, her in the church rectory, with Father O'Brien, him in a room above the marshal's office. The separation felt like punishment after weeks of constant proximity, but Grace understood the necessity. Appearances mattered to law and society even when they mattered nothing to truth. Father O'Brien was a stern Irishman in his 60s who'd seen enough of frontier life to know that rules and reality didn't always align. He questioned Grace gently that first evening, listening to her story with the patience of someone who understood that judgment came easier than understanding. You've broken your vows, child. I know, Father. You've lived alone with a man who's not your husband in circumstances that suggest impropriety, even if innocence existed. I know that too. And yet you show no remorse. Grace met his eyes directly. I show no remorse for surviving, for choosing life over death, for recognizing that vows made in fear aren't binding when courage finally arrives. Father O'Brien studied her for a long moment. Your lost child. No, Father, I'm found. For the first time in my adult life, I know exactly where I am and who I choose to be. The town hall meeting happened 3 days later, giving time for word to spread and curious citizens to gather. The building was packed, standing room only, everyone wanting to witness whatever scandal or justice was about to unfold. Judge Harold Pierce presided, a circuit judge making his monthly rounds, who'd heard enough frontier cases to understand that law and morality often occupied different territories. He called the meeting to order and laid out the basic facts as reported by Marshal Crawford. We're here to determine if crimes were committed in the confrontation between Caleb Harrison and Wade Drummond's men. This is an inquest, not a trial, but testimony given here will be used to determine if formal charges should be filed. The prosecution case, such as it was, came from Drummond's surviving men and his business associates in Silver Creek. They painted a picture of Harrison as a violent mountain man who'd stolen valuable property, meaning Grace, and murdered good men who'd come to reclaim what was legally purchased. Grace listened to herself described as property, as merchandise, as cargo, and felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. These men saw her as an object to be owned and traded, and they weren't even ashamed of saying so publicly. Then came the defense witnesses. Dutch Keller testified about mountain law and the code of hospitality that made Harrison's protection of Grace not just acceptable, but obligatory. Big John described the multiple attacks they defended against the disproportionate force Drummond had brought, the clear intent to kill rather than negotiate. Henry Two Crows spoke in careful English about seeing Grace chained like an animal at Porter's, about the righteousness of freeing captives, about how some laws mattered more than others. Samuel Porter, the trading post owner, provided testimony that made several people in the audience gasp. He described the trafficking he'd witnessed over the years, the women sold and resold, the complete lack of consequence for men like Drummond, who profited from human misery. Harrison's the first man I've seen in 3 years who looked at a woman in chains and saw a person instead of profit. If that's a crime, then law's lost its meaning. Judge Pierce called for a recess after Porter's testimony, and Grace felt the mood in the room shift. People were questioning assumptions they'd carried into the meeting, seeing the situation through different lenses. When court resumed, the judge called Grace herself to testify. She stood before the crowded room, feeling hundreds of eyes on her, judging, weighing, measuring her against expectations she'd never agreed to meet. Father O'Brien sat in the front row, his expression unreadable. Caleb sat beside the marshal, his face pale but his eyes steady on her. Judge Pierce studied her carefully. State your name for the record. Grace Marlowe, formerly Sister Grace of the Order of Mercy. Tell us in your own words what happened. So she did. She told them about the wagon train, about the massacre, about being passed from captor to captor like currency, about the weeks of abuse and the crushing certainty that death was coming. It was just a question of when and how painful it would be. She told them about Caleb trading good furs for no reason except that leaving her there felt wrong to him, about the journey to the mountain, about the cabin and the choice he gave her to leave or stay, about learning to live without fear, learning to fight, learning that safety didn't require submission. And then she told them about Drummond's men coming repeatedly, about the bounty that turned her into prey, about the siege and the battle, and the choice to fight rather than surrender to men who saw her as property. The room was absolutely silent when she finished. Judge Pierce made notes for a long moment before looking up. You understand that your presence in Harrison's cabin, unmarried and unchaperoned, violates both social norms and church law. I understand that survival sometimes requires breaking rules that were written by people who've never had to choose between dignity and death. That's not a legal answer. Then here's a legal answer. I was held against my will by men who trafficked in human beings. Mr. Harrison freed me. I chose to stay in his protection because the alternative was being captured again or dying alone in the wilderness. If law finds fault in that, then law needs examining. Father O'Brien stood suddenly. Your Honor, if I may on. Father O'Brien. The old priest approached Grace with an expression that held more sorrow than anger. You've broken your vows, Grace, poverty, chastity, obedience. All of them violated through your actions. Grace felt her heart hammer, but kept her voice steady. You're right, Father, I have broken them, and I'm about to break them again publicly and formally. The room erupted in whispers. Judge Pierce called for order. Grace raised her voice to be heard over the noise. I hereby renounce my vows to the Catholic Church. I renounce the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience that I took at age 22. I release myself from the Order of Mercy and from all obligations to ecclesiastical authority. Father O'Brien's face showed genuine pain. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. I was Sister Grace Marlowe. Now I am simply Grace Marlowe. And if this court and this community allow it, I will become Grace Harrison. The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in that room understood what she'd just done. She'd committed apostasy in front of witnesses, burning every bridge back to the life she'd known. Caleb stood slowly, supporting himself against the table. "Your Honor, I'd like to ask Miss Marlowe a question." "This is irregular, but proceed." Caleb moved toward Grace, each step clearly painful, but his purpose absolute. He stopped before her close enough that only she could hear his first words. "You sure about this?" "Never been more sure of anything." He raised his voice for the room to hear. "Grace Marlowe, will you marry me?" The room exploded again. Judge Pierce hammered for order. Grace felt tears on her face but couldn't stop smiling. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." The judge called recess while the room descended into chaos. People arguing, people celebrating, people scandalized beyond speech. Grace and Caleb stood in the center of it all, hands joined, both knowing they'd just made their private choice devastatingly public. When order finally resumed, Judge Pierce delivered his verdict with the weight of someone who understood this was about more than law. This court finds that Caleb Harrison acted in self-defense against Wade Drummond and his men. All charges of murder are dismissed. Wade Drummond will face trial for trafficking in human beings, a crime carrying significant penalties under territorial law. He turned to Grace. "Miss Marlowe, the matter of your vows and your choices falls outside civil jurisdiction. The church will make its own determinations. However, this court recognizes your right to self-determination and your status as a free woman, not bound by contracts made under different circumstances." He paused, then added, "Furthermore, if you and Mr. Harrison wish to marry, I'm authorized to perform that ceremony. Today, if you are willing." Grace looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at her. They'd survived trafficking siege battle, and now judgment. Getting married felt almost anticlimactic after everything else. "Today works," Caleb said. "Today's perfect." Grace agreed. They married in the town hall before the same crowd that had just witnessed their testimony. No flowers, no music, no ceremony beyond the essential words. Judge Pierce spoke the vows with efficient solemnity. Dutch Big John and Henry stood as witnesses. Father O'Brien attended, but didn't participate, his presence a mixture of disapproval and something that might have been blessing. When the judge pronounced them married, Caleb kissed Grace with the tenderness of someone who'd thought he'd lost the right to tenderness years ago. She kissed him back with the certainty of someone who'd finally stopped running from who she was meant to be. The community remained divided. Some celebrated the unlikely romance and the defeat of a trafficking operation. Others saw scandal and apostasy that no legal ruling could cleanse. Grace and Caleb understood they'd be discussed in parlors and churches for years to come. They didn't care. They had each other. They had justice. They had a future that was theirs to build. That night, in a room above the general store that served as their temporary home, Grace lay beside her husband and thought about the journey that had brought her here. From Boston to the frontier, from Sister Grace to simply Grace, from captivity to choice. "No regrets?" Caleb asked quietly. "Not one, son. You. Just that we can't go back to the mountain yet. Doctor says I need another week before traveling. Then we stay. Plan our life. Figure out what comes next." "What do you want to come next?" Grace thought about that. "I want to go back to the cabin, expand it, make it a home, maybe help other women who find themselves in situations like mine. Build something that matters." "We can do that. We can do anything." And in the darkness, with the sounds of Silver Creek settling towards sleep around them, they believed it. The years that followed proved them right. But that's a story best told from the other end, when time had worked its transformations and legacy had settled into the shape of truth. The porch boards creaked under the weight of 64 years as Caleb Harrison finished his story. The sun had moved across the sky during the telling painting, the mountains in shades of gold and purple, that made them look like the paintings Grace sometimes made during winter months. Caleb Jr. sat silent, absorbing everything his grandfather had told him. The violence and the love, the fear and the courage, the complexity of choices that look simple only in retrospect. "So you married Grandma the same day she renounced her vows. Seemed like the thing to do when you know you know. And you came back to the mountain. 2 weeks later, soon as the doctor cleared me to travel." Caleb gestured toward the expanded cabin that now sprawled across what had once been a simple clearing. "Started building the day we got back. 40 years of building, actually. Still not quite finished." Grace emerged from the cabin, silver-haired and strong-backed, carrying a tray with lemonade that she'd made that morning. At 56, she moved with the confidence of someone who'd long since made peace with every choice that defined her. Are you filling that boy's head with stories? Just telling him how we met? You mean the sanitized version or the truth? The truth, he's old enough to hear it. Grace set the tray down and settled into the chair beside Caleb's, their hands finding each other automatically. Caleb Jr. watched the gesture, seeing in it decades of partnership and choice. Grandma, you really killed a man. I did, and I'd do it again to protect your grandfather. She paused, then added, but I've also helped bring 32 children into this world, including your father. I've taught 17 women to read and write. I've nursed 40-some people through illnesses that would have killed them without care. Those are the things I think about when I remember who I am. The sound of voices drifted from inside the cabin. 3 generations gathering for Sunday dinner, a tradition Grace had instituted and defended through 40 years of mountain living. Thomas Harrison, 29 years old, and the spitting image of his father at that age, emerged with his wife Mary. Their 3 children followed, including young Caleb, who would leave for war training in a week. Sarah Harrison came next with her husband David and their daughter Emma, 6 years old, and already showing signs of the stubborn intelligence her grandmother was known for. Samuel Harrison, the youngest at 23, arrived last, having ridden up from Denver, where he was studying medicine. His presence always delighted Grace, proof that their children had choices beyond mountain survival. They gathered around the expanded table that Caleb and Thomas had built 5 years earlier, designed specifically to accommodate 3 generations and whatever friends might join them. Grace said the blessing, her words simple and personal, more conversation with God than formal prayer. During the meal, stories flowed like the wine Thomas had brought from town. Stories of the early years when Caleb and Grace had lived on hope and stubbornness. Stories of the 3 rescues they'd performed over the years. Women fleeing bad situations who'd heard rumors of a mountain refuge and found it. Tell them about grandfather Josiah, young Caleb suggested, and the table went quiet. Old Caleb exchanged a look with Grace. She nodded slightly, giving permission for a story he still found difficult even after years of resolution. In the spring of 1885, 12 years after your grandmother and I married, I got a letter from Missouri. My father was dying. He told them about the journey back, about finding his father aged beyond his years, about the reconciliation that had seemed impossible for so long. I told him I was sorry for leaving the way I did, sorry for the years we'd lost. He told me he was sorry too, sorry for being so rigid, so certain that his way was God's only way. Caleb's voice roughened. He said he'd been wrong, that watching me live my life with integrity and courage and love had taught him that righteousness takes many forms. What did he say about Grandma? Sarah asked. He said, son, you found God's grace in a woman named Grace. That's too perfect to be anything but divine plan. Caleb smiled at the memory. They talked for hours, he and your grandmother, about faith and doubt and what it means to live well. He died 3 days later with both of us there. His last words were, I'm proud of you, son. Grace squeezed his hand, remembering those 3 days in Missouri when broken relationships had finally healed. He was a good man who let fear make him rigid, but in the end, love won. It usually does if you give it time. After dinner, the family dispersed to various activities. The children played in the yard where Grace had planted wildflowers that bloomed reliably each summer. The adults sat on the porch watching sunset paint the mountains in colors that never got old. Young Caleb approached his grandparents as the light began to fail. Can I ask you something? Always, Grace answered. I'm scared. About the war, about leaving, about everything I don't know. His voice cracked slightly. How did you do it? How did you face everything that came at you and not break? Caleb and Grace looked at each other, 3 decades of shared life passing between them in that glance. Caleb spoke first. We broke, son, many times. Your grandmother broke when she watched her friends die. I broke when I executed that soldier. We broke during the siege, during the trial, during the hard years when we weren't sure we'd survive the next winter. But you got back up. We got back up because we had each other. Because we remembered that fear means you're human, not that you're weak. And because we decided that some things are worth fighting for even when you're terrified. Grace added her wisdom. I broke every vow I made to the church. But I kept every promise I made to myself and to your grandfather. Sometimes the holiest thing you can do is walk away from what everyone else says is holy and choose what's true for you. What if I don't know what's true for me? Then you take the next step anyway. Truth reveals itself through action, not contemplation. You'll figure it out by doing, not by thinking about doing. Young Caleb nodded slowly, not entirely comforted, but less afraid than he'd been. One more question. Ask. Do you regret any of it? The vows you broke, the life you left behind, the normal path you didn't take? Grace stood and moved to stand at the porch railing, looking out at the valley where she'd learned to live without fear. Caleb joined her, their shoulders touching, in the way of people who'd learned each other's geography through decades of proximity. I regret nothing that led me here, Grace said finally. This place, this family, this life. It's been harder than anything I imagined in that Boston convent. And it's been more real, more true, more fully lived than any comfortable existence could have been. When you leave next week, Caleb told his grandson, you'll carry our story with you. Not as a burden, but as a reminder that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing right when wrong is easier. It's standing up when everyone expects you to kneel. It's loving when love looks impossible. He showed the boy his old rifle, the Hawken that had seen him through war and mountain life and everything between. This was my father's. He gave it to me before I left for war, even though we were fighting about everything else. Now I'm giving it to you. Young Caleb took the rifle with reverent hands, feeling the weight of history and expectation. I'll take care of it. I know you will, and when you come home, you'll have your own stories to tell. Make them good ones, make them true. The family stayed until full dark, until the mountain cold sent them toward warm houses and comfortable beds. Grace and Caleb remained on the porch, as they often did, watching stars emerge, in skies clearer than anything the lowlands could offer. Do you think he'll be all right? Grace asked, meaning their grandson, but also meaning all the young people facing uncertain futures. I think he comes from people who survived by choosing each other and choosing right. That's in his blood now. We did good, didn't we? With the kids, the life, all of it. Caleb pulled her close, her head settling naturally onto his shoulder, the way it had 40 years ago during that storm that changed everything. We did better than good. We built something that matters, something that lasts. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the familiar constellations wheel overhead. The cabin behind them held 40 years of accumulated living. The valley around them had witnessed their struggles and triumphs, and the mountain stood witness to it all, patient and eternal, and completely indifferent to human drama, while somehow making space for it. When young Caleb left a week later, he carried his grandfather's rifle, his grandmother's rosary that she'd kept as a reminder of where she'd been, and the knowledge that holiness wasn't found in vows or institutions or other people's expectations. It was forged in choices made when the whole world said you were wrong. In standing beside someone when standing alone would be easier. In refusing to surrender to fear or cruelty or the grinding weight of impossible circumstances. 3 months later, Grace would receive a letter from her grandson, written from a training camp back east. He wrote about the rifle which shot true and earned respect from men who knew good weapons. He wrote about the rosary which he carried not for religious reasons, but as a reminder that strength came in unexpected forms. And he wrote this, Grandpa, I finally understand what you were trying to tell me. It's not about being fearless. It's about being faithful to what matters even when you're terrified. Thank you for showing me what that looks like. Grace read the letter to Caleb that evening on the porch, and they sat together as the sun set over mountains that had sheltered them for 4 decades. Two people who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances and built something beautiful from the wreckage. We done good, Caleb said finally. We did, Grace agreed. We really did. And as darkness settled over the valley, as the first stars emerged and the mountain wind carried the scent of pine and possibility, they held each other and knew that their story would outlive them. Not because it was extraordinary, though it was, but because it was true. Because they'd chosen each other when choosing was dangerous. Because they'd stood together when standing was costly. Because they had refused to let other people's definitions of holy or right or proper dictate how they lived and loved and built their legacy. The mountains would remember. The family would remember. And somewhere in that remembering, two broken people who'd found wholeness in each other would continue to matter long after the last echo of their voices faded into mountain wind and star-filled silence.